Welcome back, everyone, to Making Waves, the show from the Chicago Maritime Museum all about our city's past and present on the waterways. I'm Madeline Crispell, the museum's curator, and with me, as always, is Sari Breslin, the museum's education director.
Thanks, Madeline. During our first season here on Making Waves, we've talked about all kinds of things happening on and around Chicago's waterways. But today, we're going to talk about what's going on under the water. Our guest today is Kendra Kennedy, who has over 20 years of experience as an archaeologist, both maritime and terrestrial, in the Midwest, Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, and Gulf South.
Kendra is employed as a maritime archaeologist with the Wisconsin Historical Society and previously worked as a cultural resources specialist with Argonne National Laboratory. Ms. Kennedy has an undergraduate degree in anthropology, French, and computer applications from the University of Notre Dame, and a master's degree in historical archaeology with a maritime archaeology concentration from the University of West Florida. She has worked as an archaeological consultant, compliance reviewer, instructor, and grant writer for various organizations and agencies, including as a reviewer and maritime archaeologist at the Ohio State Historic Preservation Office, and a deep-water marine archaeologist for the oil and gas industry in Texas. Ms. Kennedy is passionate about public outreach and working with citizen scientists to advance the discipline. She currently serves as the archaeological advisor to the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago, which meets at the museum, and as a board member of the Advisory Council on Underwater Archaeology. Oh, with an intro like that. Welcome, Kendra. We're so happy to have you today.
Well, thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you, Sari, for having me on the show.
That is such an impressive resume. So, as all of these terrestrial and archaeological, what I really liked about that is the citizen archaeologist.
Citizen scientist.
Citizen scientist. What can archaeology underwater tell us about the importance of the Great Lakes?
So the Great Lakes are such a central aspect to our region and to the nation, to the development of the United States. And often, you don't think about Chicago as a maritime city, right? Mm-hmm. But it is, right? It's that inland city with that maritime connection. And because of the Great Lakes and that water highway that it created that brought people, that brought goods into the area, and also helped transport raw materials from the upper Great Lakes area, right, from Minnesota, from Illinois, from Wisconsin, from Indiana, down to the lower Great Lakes and the East Coast.
And we can see right now a map of this region that we're talking about. And I think it's helpful when you look at a map just of this area, you get a sense of how much these bodies of water really are inland seas.
Absolutely, right? People think of lakes, and of course they think of small lakes, that you visit on the weekend. They don't think about the scope of the Great Lakes and how, again, as you said, these are inland seas. These are waterways where vessels have transited for centuries to affect commerce and to bring immigrants, to bring people to the area, and then the reverse, right? So the Great Lakes are so central to the history of our nation, and that's something that sometimes gets forgotten, right? And you don't think about the fact that so many of these states have this water connection, even though they're in the heart of our country.
That's a great point. And, certainly as the curator of the Chicago Maritime Museum, I often get asked by some of my coastal counterparts, why does Chicago have a maritime museum? Isn't that a landlocked city? And of course, we have this great image here of Chicago in 1868, and you can just see the bustling port activity. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. We think about the railroads or the airport, but what about this maritime trade?
Right, and that's absolutely true. Chicago is the city it is and has the importance it does, originally because of that connection via the Great Lakes to the rest of the country and the region, right? So you had people who were able to travel from Buffalo, New York, right? From Cleveland, Ohio, all the way over via the Great Lakes from Erie, Pennsylvania, to Chicago. And so you can see in this picture, this is an 1868 bird's eye view of Chicago. You see the harbor, right? That Lake Michigan around the Chicago River, which is the river that you see in the center of the image, is bustling with ships, with sailing vessels, with steamboats. And because those vessels could come in and use the port, and then those goods could be taken farther along via the river system, right? That's why Chicago is what it is today. So that's why it's a maritime city, and why the water and the lakes are so important to Chicago.
So, our viewers, of course, would know this if they've watched any of the other episodes of our season, that Chicago is this amazing maritime cultural heritage and history. But the underwater archaeologists, how is the work that you're doing advancing that history? What are the kind of sites that you're looking at? People may have this image of the archaeologist using the toothbrush to, get the dust off a fossil. What is it that you guys are doing?
So we are diving on submerged archaeological sites. In general, people think of shipwrecks, and that's very true, right? That's a lot of what we do. Diving on shipwrecks, vessels that wrecked, that sank into the lakes, and that still remain there on the bottom to tell us the stories, these individual stories of the captains and the crew and the cargo that they carried. So a good example is a wreck that we've been studying through the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago.
We have a photo of this right here.
Yeah,
you can
absolutely.
see the ship's wheel right in the middle.
Exactly. And this vessel, we call it Nicole's wreck because it was found by Captain Nicole of Double Action Dive Charters while she was captaining a charter in the Chicago area. So this was actually found. It was noticed on the fish finder. No one knew that this wreck was here, even though it's in only 50 feet of water.
Wow.
And you hear about these kinds of discoveries, whether they're shallow, whether they're deep, when someone finds a wreck by accident or they intentionally go out and search. There was actually just a couple of wrecks announced that were found in Lake Michigan recently. These shipwrecks tell us about the story of commerce and immigration to our region,
And
right?
where was this Nicole's wreck?
So Nicole's wreck is about 5 miles straight off of Montrose Harbor, right? And the fact that it hadn't been found, even though it was in 50 feet of water, is, again, as I said, it's surprising, but it happens. The lakes are vast, and it's very easy to miss something very small, right? Just a few hundred feet in length, when you consider the scope of the lake. So the wreck that you see in the image, right, the ship's wheel is present, lots of the structure of the wreck is present, and in fact, the cargo is also still there. It's iron ore cargo, and it's scattered all over the shipwreck and adjacent to it. So it really tells us that story, right? This iron ore likely was coming from Michigan, right? From over on Lake Superior, and was being brought down probably to Chicago for industrial purposes, and the vessel wrecked. And that cargo never made it to its intended port, but so many other cargoes did, bringing lumber and stone and iron ore and other raw goods for manufacturing in the various cities around the lakes.
Wow, this is so interesting. What got you interested in even starting to do this?
Right, how does somebody become a marine archaeologist?
What is a terrestrial?
So, maritime archaeologist is someone who studies interactions with the maritime environment, people and their interactions with the maritime environment. Terrestrial is just land-based archaeology, right? So it's the archaeologist you think of, where you were mentioning.
Not aliens.
No, that would be extraterrestrial.
Oh, right.
Terrestrial archaeologists, and generally I find that they don't like to be called terrestrial archaeologists, right? They're just archaeologists.
Okay.
But we need to distinguish when we're talking about the two different fields.
Okay.
So as far as maritime archaeology, I knew pretty early on that I was fascinated by history and another field called anthropology, which is the study of humans in general. And archaeology is a subdiscipline of anthropology. And so I think probably my fascination with history and the way people do what they do probably stemmed from my father, who's a big history buff, and he would, read me stories from this Atlas of Ancient History, and tell me all about the civilizations like Egypt and the Mayans and the Incas, right, and other civilizations around the world, and that really started my interest. My parents are both originally from Chicago. I grew up in Wisconsin. We would travel to Lake Michigan all the time. We would travel all up and down the coast. We would swim. We would walk along the beach, and then I had, we had friends we would go out on their boats on the water, and I just really developed that love of Lake Michigan and of the Great Lakes so early on, and then. When I decided to complete my undergraduate degree, I completed it in anthropology in order to study archaeology. I worked for a couple of years in the field as a terrestrial archaeologist. And then I thought, I really want to get more into this. And I knew I had gotten certified as a scuba diver while I was at the University of Notre Dame. And I thought, I really want to embrace this interest in maritime archaeology to combine my love of history and diving. And so I went to the University of West Florida, where I
think we have a picture.
Yeah, we do have a great picture of this.
This is a couple of my graduate student colleagues when I was at the University of West Florida, and Hans, Wayne, and Siska. And Wayne, actually in the center, is also originally from Wisconsin, from the Elroy area. And we had so many opportunities at the University of West Florida to dive on shipwrecks in Pensacola Bay and in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see here we're actually working in Pensacola Bay on a submerged archaeological site. And so there I really, I got my degree in maritime archaeology. I really got that chance to dive on some fascinating archaeological sites. And for a while, I worked in a variety of places. As I said, as you mentioned, I worked in Texas in the deepwater marine industry. I also worked in Maryland with state underwater archaeologist Susan Langley. I worked in Ohio as a compliance reviewer as well as a maritime archaeologist, so working in Lake Erie. And then at Argonne National Lab. And I was very fortunate to accept a position at the Wisconsin Historical Society, where I now work as a maritime archaeologist.
We have a photo of one of these dives that you did up with the Wisconsin.
Yes.
You can see that right here. Is that you in this photo?
Yes, that is me in that photo. It's taken by my colleague, Tammy Thompson. And this was just a beautiful site. This is actually not very deep. It's only about 10 feet deep.
Wow.
But this was, we were doing the work in May up in Door County. So it was frigid, right? I think it was about 37, 39 degrees when this picture was taken. taken. So you can see it looks like I'm diving in a tropical paradise. And it certainly was a paradise for a maritime archaeologist, but it wasn't tropical. It was freezing. So, but one of my favorite projects that I've worked on with the Wisconsin Historical Society.
So the water in this image is totally crystal clear. I mean, it looks like you could be in the Bahamas in this photo. Is diving in the Great Lakes on these archaeological sites, how similar or different is that to diving on archaeological sites, say, in the Bahamas or in an ocean, a saltwater ocean?
Right. And there are a lot of differences. Obviously, you have the saltwater environment. When you're not in the Great Lakes, you have the freshwater environment in the Great Lakes. So there's a slight difference in the buoyancy. When you're in saltwater, you're a bit more buoyant as opposed to freshwater. But really, the biggest issue is the cold of the Great Lakes, right? Like anyone who's been, on the beach in May, on Lake Michigan knows that, you really might not want to get in the water. And so you have to deal with some supreme cold when you're diving in the Great Lakes. And that's why in the image that we showed, I'm actually wearing a dry suit. So the previous images of folks, some of my colleagues in Pensacola, they were wearing wetsuits. And it's very simple, right? A wetsuit, you wear it, you get wet while you're in the water. A dry suit, it maintains that layer of air against you. It keeps the water out. And then because of that, it keeps you drier while you're in the water, right?
Does it keep you warm, though?
It doesn't specifically keep you warm, but because you're not getting wet, you stay warmer longer, and you're able to work in these cold temperatures. So that's one of the big differences, right, when you're talking about the cold temperatures of the Great Lakes.
You said this was in only 10 feet of water, and if somebody... anybody could come upon this.
Absolutely,
correct?
Absolutely.
If I was swimming and I saw this, could I take a souvenir?
That's a really good question. So, no. Please do not take souvenirs from the shipwrecks. These shipwrecks represent the communal history of people living around the Great Lakes, as well as of our country, and human history in general. There are laws, specifically the Abandoned Shipwreck Act of 1967, that protect these shipwrecks. And when they are on the submerged bottomlands, they belong to the federal government and are managed by the states. And so removing, both with this act and with state laws, it is illegal to remove artifacts from these wrecks. So please, everyone can
gold.
They can, no gold. Everyone can dive on these wrecks and enjoy them. Or we have plenty, as you see, shallow wrecks where people can kayak and paddle over them or snorkel or swim over them and can enjoy these wrecks for the history that they provide. But, hands off. Please only take pictures and leave only bubbles.
I love that. Yeah, and I had no idea anybody could just dive on these. I thought they were restricted, or you had to have a permit or something to dive on them, but no.
Yeah, no, you don't have to have a permit. I think there may be some cases where there are underwater preserves where you do need a permit in other states, but in general, you can dive on these wrecks if they're known to the public. In fact, in Wisconsin, we have a website called wisconsinshipwrecks.org. Anyone can take a look at it. All of the recorded wrecks that we've identified, hundreds of recorded wrecks, there's information on them. There's some have been found, some have not been. Those that have been found, there's coordinates so that people can go out in a boat, or they can paddle or kayak or swim out to these wrecks. They can take a look. They can see pictures, things that we've, site plans that we've produced from studying these, and learn about this history of these submerged archaeological sites.
Now, of course, if you're in the Chicago area, you can also come down to the Chicago Maritime Museum, where we have an excellent interactive map in our exhibition on the Lady Elgin shipwreck, where you can go through and look at all of the different underwater archaeological sites that the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago has surveyed. And, this idea of surveying, anybody, of course, can go take a look at one of these sites, but what is the actual work that the archaeologists are doing? And I know we have a photo here of somebody, believe it or not, taking notes underwater.
Right.
Can you tell us what we're seeing in this photo?
Sure. So this is one of our divers from the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago. They have a slate which has on it a kind of plastic drafting paper called mylar, and then they're using a pencil, just your typical mechanical pencil, right, to record notes about the wreck. You can see a tape measure stretching behind them, which we lay down in order to measure certain features of the wreck. And then we have a folding rule that we can measure smaller items on the wreck. And then we take all of this information that's gathered from our survey dives, and then we produce a scale site plan that shows the full extent of the wreck, what it looks like, the various features on it, and then that information we provide to the state and is provided in a variety of other ways so that people understand these wrecks and learn about their history.
Who would have thought you could just write with a pencil underwater?
Right.
A mechanical pencil.
Absolutely, and it's the simplest mechanical pencil. Those simple yellow mechanical pencils you can buy anywhere.
that?
Right? Those are the best to use. On
Go
these
try it
sites.
out,
Yeah.
everybody. We'll see if you can. It could be a trick you could do for your friend.
I'll tell you, it's not easy to draw and to write underwater. So when you come up, you sometimes think, "Wow, I thought that looked a lot better under the water." But then you take that information and you make a sketch, a site plan out of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is it all under the water, or?
So that's a really good question. There's a lot of terms we use as maritime archaeologists: underwater archaeologists, maritime archaeologists, marine archaeologists. But basically, what we do is it involves human interaction with the water environment. So some of it is actually very shallow kind of work or work on land adjacent to shore that doesn't involve diving at all. We
have a photo of one of these
Right.
sites that you can see here.
So this is a photo of us working. This is with the Wisconsin Historical Society up in Door County, and we are working on a submerged pier site. And I mean, like a pier or a dock that used to be there, that was the focus, the center point of a small community that no longer exists.
Wow.
And we've been studying a lot of these vanished pier communities, or ghost ports as we call them, because these communities were established because there was a resource on the interior, like trees for timber, stone, whatever it was, that somebody would establish a small community, build a pier, they would harvest that resource, and then the lake vessels would come to that pier and take it to cities like Chicago, like Milwaukee, that needed those raw materials.
Wow.
Now, I think we've covered pretty well here today the importance of maritime archaeology, the importance of preserving these sites, all of the interesting, things we can do when we have this data and information. Mm-hmm. Is that understood? Is this a field that's being funded? What are some of the challenges facing underwater archaeology?
Sure, that's a good question. And right now, historic preservation in general, right, preserving our sites as well as our buildings and structures that are important to our history, doesn't necessarily receive as much funding as we'd like to see, right? This is our non-renewable history. And because there isn't necessarily that much funding for historic preservation and for maritime archaeology, certainly, there's actually each state out of the 50 has a state historic preservation office. But there's only 10 states in our country that have either a maritime archaeologist on staff, a maritime program, or a maritime archaeologist that works with the state historic
10 out
preservation
of the 50.
10 out of the 50.
And think how many have,
Have
water.
maritime resources, absolutely.
Wow.
Wisconsin is one that's fortunate to have a very old program in maritime archaeology. Michigan's another. At this time, Illinois doesn't have one, but fortunately, working with groups like the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago, with a volunteer group, what we call avocational archaeologists, people are able to do a lot more work with the help of those very passionate volunteers to do underwater archaeology, even when there isn't that network behind it. And even in states like Wisconsin, where we have a well-established program, we constantly are very use our volunteers and are very happy to have our volunteers to do this work.
Volunteers, what if I wanted to become a diver? What do I have
good question.
to do?
Absolutely. So if you would like to become a diver, you could contact a local dive shop. There are dozens of dive shops in the Chicago area and all over. You can contact them and say, I want to become a diver. You'll start with your open water certification. That's your basic level of dive certification. There's some online classes. There's work in pool work. And then you'll dive, in a local lake to get that open water experience, and you'll be certified.
Is it like getting your driver's license? Do you have to be 16?
So that's a good question. Most agencies, I believe, the kind of initial age to get involved in scuba is the age of 10. But each parent has to determine, right, are their kids ready for that kind of thing? Because diving is. You have to be very concerned about safety. You really have to pay attention to what you're doing, the environment around you. You have to be very self-aware and aware of what's around you. And so some parents, may decide, I'm going to wait until they're 12 or 14 or 16. But, anyone, 16, 18 and above can go and get that open water certification and start diving in Lake Michigan and elsewhere.
We have one last photo, Kendra, of two divers here. Could you tell us what's going on in this photo just while we wrap up?
Absolutely. So this really speaks to, again, that need for volunteers. These are a couple volunteer divers from the Underwater Archaeological Society of Chicago. They're recording some of the features of Nicole's wreck that we talked about before. And so that we can provide that information to the state so that the state knows, exactly what resources that it has. And also then that promotes, enjoyment by recreational divers of these resources. So without volunteers, it would be a lot harder to do underwater archaeology around the Great Lakes.
Well, Kendra, this was so fascinating.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, absolutely.
If you are interested in learning more, you can always check out Wisconsin Shipwrecks. You can look up the Wisconsin Historical Society to see Ms. Kendra Kennedy's work. And of course, Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 4, you can always come down and join us at the Chicago Maritime Museum. Check out our website anytime at chicagomaritimemuseum.org.
And remember, be safe and respect the water.
Always.
Always. Thank you, Kendra.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.